The morning of May 18th, 1919 in Washington, D.C. was characterized by a deceptive atmospheric stillness. At the intersection of Wisconsin Avenue and R Street, the humidity of the Potomac Basin began to settle over the manicured lawns of the McLean estate. The silence was not a lack of sound, but a void waiting to be filled. It was punctured at precisely 11:15 a.m. by the high-pitched mechanical whine of a 1919 Packard delivery truck. In this era, automotive engineering was in a state of primitive transition. These vehicles lacked hydraulic braking systems, relying instead on mechanical drum brakes that required significant physical force and distance to achieve a full stop. The truck, a mass of steel and wood weighing nearly 3 tons, was a lethal kinetic force in a world still accustomed to the pace of horse-drawn carriages. Vincent Walsh McLean, known to the international press as the $100 million baby, was 9 years old. His life was a study in extreme insulation. His father, Ned McLean, had spent over $15,000 in 1919, roughly $285,000 in 2026 currency, on a specialized private security detail intended to shadow the boy every second of his existence. Vincent's world was one of gold-threaded linens, and a nursery equipped with a miniature electric train set that cost more than a standard American home. On this morning, however, the security protocol failed. A momentary lapse by a distracted governess allowed the boy to bolt toward the gates. He was chasing a ball, or perhaps simply the concept of unmonitored space. The impact was not loud. It was a dull, wet thud followed by the screech of metal shoes against the pavement as the driver, an ordinary man named Raymond Stevens, desperately hauled the handbrake. Inside the mansion, Evalyn Walsh McLean was adjusting the Hope diamond around her neck. The stone, a 45.52-carat Type Sequitous-B deep blue diamond, was at that moment exerting a subtle physical pressure on her collarbone. Chemically, the Hope diamond is unique. Its blue hue is derived from trace amounts of boron, but its most chilling feature is its red phosphorescence. When exposed to ultraviolet light, the stone glows like a hot coal for several seconds after the source is removed. As Evalyn heard the scream from the street, she looked into a mirror. The diamond seemed to pulse. At the time of the accident, the United States was navigating the volatile aftermath of the Great War. The economy was shifting from wartime production to a consumer-driven model, yet the social divide remained cavernous. A family like the McLeans possessed a net worth that, when adjusted to 2026 values, exceeded $2.1 billion. This wealth was meant to be a fortress. Instead, it had become a gilded cage that failed at its only essential task, the preservation of the bloodline. While Evalyn rushed to the window, the Hope diamond, purchased from Pierre Cartier under a cloud of warnings, remained cold against her skin. The Tavernier curse, a narrative often dismissed as a clever marketing ploy by French jewelers to increase the stone's mystique, had suddenly manifested as a physical reality. The boy who was supposed to inherit the McLean and Walsh empires lay broken on the asphalt. Medical technology in 1919 was incapable of addressing the internal hemorrhaging caused by high-velocity blunt force trauma. Despite the presence of the finest physicians money could summon, Vincent Walsh McLean died within the hour. The irony was suffocating. Evalyn had recently spent a fortune on blessing the diamond, taking it to a priest to exorcise the spirits of its previous owners, including Marie Antoinette and the Sultan Abdul Hamid II. She believed she had domesticated the stone. But as the news of the heir's death rippled through the social registers of the 400, the realization set in: the diamond did not care about the gold of the Walsh mines or the influence of the Washington Post. It had taken its first installment of flesh interest. The era of the McLeans was no longer about accumulation. It was about the beginning of a long, agonizing evaporation. To understand the momentum that led to this blood-stained pavement, one must look back to the dark, suffocating tunnels where this tragedy was funded. The origin of the McLean tragedy does not lie in a jewelry box in Paris, but in the telluride veins of the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. In 1896, the American economy was gripped by the free silver debate, and the tail end of a brutal depression. Thomas Walsh, an Irish immigrant with a rudimentary education and an obsessive eye for geology, was prospecting in an area others had abandoned. While the industry was focused on silver, Walsh was looking for the red tellurides that signaled the presence of high-grade gold. His discovery of the Camp Bird mine was a tectonic shift in the distribution of American wealth. By 1900, the mine was producing over $3 million in gold annually, a staggering $118 million per year in 2026 purchasing power. Evalyn Walsh was born into the harsh utilitarian reality of a mining camp, but she was rapidly transplanted into a world of incomprehensible luxury. Thomas Walsh, driven by the classic immigrant desire to overcompensate for past poverty, began to remodel his daughter into a social weapon. The Walsh family moved to Washington, D.C., where they commissioned the construction of a mansion at 2020 Massachusetts Avenue. The building, designed by architect Henry Anderson, was a 60-room Beaux-Arts masterpiece costing $835,000 in 1903, roughly $32 million today. The engineering of the house included a private elevator, an internal telephone system, and a ballroom with a floor specifically sprung for dancing. This was the Gilded Age architecture of dominance, designed to signal to the established political elite that the new money from the West had arrived. Evalyn's education was an exercise in pure consumption. She was sent to Paris to attend finishing schools where the curriculum was less about intellectual rigor and more about the mastery of the social mask. The cost of her wardrobe alone during this period would have funded a mid-sized factory for a year. It was here that her psychological relationship with money was forged. She saw her father use gold to bypass social barriers, to buy influence, and to silence critics. She learned that every problem had a price tag. In 1900, the gold standard was the law of the land, and the Walsh family held the source of that law. Evalyn was not just a girl. She was the human embodiment of the Camp Bird vein. In Paris, she crossed paths with Edward Ned McLean. Ned was the heir to the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Washington Post, representing the fusion of industrial wealth and media power. His family, the McLeans, were the gatekeepers of Washington society. Ned was a man of limited intellectual depth, already showing signs of the chronic alcoholism that would later dismantle his sanity. He was a creature of the Gilded Age decadence, a man who had never been denied a single impulse. Their meeting was a collision of two fortunes that, combined, created a gravitational pull that few in the Western world could escape. The context of the era favored such unions. The Sherman Antitrust Act was being debated, and the titans of industry were consolidating power through marriage to avoid the fragmentation of their estates. While Thomas Walsh saw Ned as a way to cement the Walsh name into the permanent political fabric of the United States, Evalyn saw Ned as a partner in a lifelong quest for stimulation. They were two children playing with the wealth of empires. Behind the scenes, the Camp Bird mine was beginning to reach its geological limits, and the transition from a mining-based fortune to a media-based power structure was fraught with risk. Thomas Walsh's lungs were already failing from years of inhaling silica dust in the mines, a technical reality of the era's lack of respiratory protection for miners. He was dying, and he was in a hurry to see Evalyn settled. He believed he was securing her future. He did not realize that by merging the Walsh gold with the McLean influence, he was creating the perfect conductor for the curse she was about to buy in a Parisian salon. The gold of Colorado had opened the doors of the world, but it was the diamonds of Europe that would eventually lock them from the outside. The union of Evalyn Walsh and Edward Ned McLean in 1908 was not a romantic endeavor. It was a high-stakes merger of American capital and political influence. In the hierarchical ecosystem of Washington, D.C., the Walsh gold provided the raw power, while the McLean name provided the historical legitimacy. The wedding occurred just as the American economy was recalibrating after the Panic of 1907, a financial crisis that had seen J.P. Morgan intervene to prevent the collapse of the banking system. In a period when the average American worker earned less than $600 a year, Thomas Walsh and John Roll McLean bestowed upon the couple a honeymoon fund of $100,000. In 2026 currency, this equates to approximately $370,000 of liquid capital intended for a single European excursion. The logistics of their travel were a marvel of early 20th century engineering. The couple crossed the Atlantic aboard the RMS Mauritania, the pinnacle of the Cunard Line. The ship was powered by 4 Parsons steam turbines generating 70,000 horsepower, capable of maintaining a speed of 28 knots. To accommodate Evalyn's requirements, the couple occupied the Regal Suite, which featured private promenades and mahogany paneling. Their luggage consisted of 50 custom-ordered Louis Vuitton steamer trunks. These were not mere boxes. They were engineered containers made of kiln-dried poplar wood, covered in monogrammed canvas and reinforced with vulcanized fiber and brass hardware. Each trunk weighed over 100 pounds when empty, requiring a specialized team of porters just to manage the transition from rail to ship. While in Paris, the McLeans stayed at the Hotel Bristol, the epicenter of Gilded Age decadence. It was here that Evalyn's psychological addiction to gemstones transitioned into a mania. She encountered the Star of the East, a 94.80-carat pear-shaped diamond of exceptional purity. In technical terms, the stone was a type Defied diamond, characterized by an almost complete absence of nitrogen impurities, giving it a whiter-than-white appearance. The purchase price was $120,000, or $4,050,000 today. Ned McLean, whose primary contribution to the marriage was the consumption of high-proof bonded whiskey and the erratic management of his family's newspapers, signed the bank drafts without hesitation. The social context of Washington at this time was dominated by Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt. Alice was the arbiter of social status, and she viewed the Walsh-McLean union with a mixture of amusement and disdain. The McLeans owned the Washington Post, a media entity that was then a partisan tool used to manipulate local politics and secure government contracts. The printing presses of the Post at the time were massive Hoe & Co. rotary machines capable of churning out 24,000 copies per hour. Ned used the paper's influence as a social shield, while Evalyn used her growing jewelry collection as a social sword. However, the internal mechanics of the marriage were already failing. Ned's alcoholism was not merely a social habit, it was a neurotoxic dependency that led to frequent bouts of dipsomania, a 1908 medical term for uncontrollable alcohol craving. He began to secrete bottles of absinthe, a spirit containing the chemical compound thujone, which in high doses could cause tremors and hallucinations. The couple's return to the United States was marked by an arrogance that bordered on the pathological. They had spent millions of dollars in a matter of months, signaling to the world that the McLean fortune was an inexhaustible resource. They were the masters of the Gilded Age peak, unaware that the tectonic plates of the global economy were shifting toward the First World War. Ned McLean believed his wealth could buy silence and loyalty indefinitely. He was about to enter a negotiation with Pierre Cartier that would prove his signature was not just an authorization of payment, but a death warrant for his family's peace. In early 1911, the global jewelry market was undergoing a transformation led by Pierre Cartier, a master of both gemology and psychological marketing. Cartier understood that the ultra-wealthy of the era were no longer satisfied with mere aesthetics. They required provenance, even if that provenance was lethal. He targeted Evalyn McLean with the precision of a predator. He knew she was bored, incredibly wealthy, and possessed a superstitious streak that made her vulnerable to the narrative of the Tavernier Blue. The diamond in question was a 45.52-carat stone of a deep, steely blue hue. Chemically, its coloration is the result of boron atoms substituting for carbon in the crystal lattice. This specific impurity also causes the stone to act as a semiconductor. The Hope Diamond's history was a chronicle of disaster. It had been stolen from the French Blue during the Revolution, recut to hide its identity, and associated with the gruesome deaths of Marie Antoinette and the Princesse de Lamballe. Cartier presented the stone to Evalyn at the Hotel Bristol, but he did not sell it as a jewel. He sold it as a challenge. He told her it was amaldicuado, cursed. For a woman who had never been told no, the curse was the ultimate luxury. The agreed-upon price was $180,000. In 2026 value, this represents an investment of $5,220,000. The contract of sale was a legal oddity of the era. It contained a clause stating that if any fatality should occur to the family of Edward B. McLean within 6 months, the diamond could be exchanged for other jewelry of equal value. The transfer of the stone required a security protocol that was remarkably advanced for 1911. It was transported in a lead-lined box to protect it from the rudimentary X-ray machines of the time, which some believed could alter the diamond's molecular structure. Upon receiving the stone in Washington, Evalyn immediately sought to neutralize its history. She invited Father William Russell of St. Patrick's Catholic Church to the McLean mansion. The ritual involved the use of a silver thurible for incense and the recitation of the exorcism of objects. The priest blessed the diamond with holy water, an act that Evalyn believed had domesticated the blue shadow. The social reality of 1911 was one of extreme contrast. While Evalyn was blessing a $6 million stone, the United States was reeling from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which had killed 146 garment workers due to a lack of safety engineering. The Standard Oil monopoly was being dismantled by the Supreme Court, signaling the end of the unfettered robber baron era. Evalyn remained oblivious to these shifts. She wore the diamond constantly. She even fashioned a special silk-lined collar for her favorite Great Dane, Mike. The dog, a 150-pound specimen of German breeding, would frequently wander through the McLean parties, wearing the most dangerous object in the world around its neck. Technically, the Hope Diamond possesses a unique physical trait: red phosphorescence. When exposed to short-wave ultraviolet light, the diamond continues to glow with a blood-red light for several seconds after the light source is removed. To the guests at the McLean mansion, this was a parlor trick. To the paranoid, it was the stone's heartbeat. Evalyn's husband, Ned, was becoming increasingly paranoid. His legal advisors warned him that the purchase was an unnecessary provocation of fate. The McLeans were now the owners of the Post, the Inquirer, and the Hope. They controlled the news, the money, and the myth. But the diamond's red glow was not a sign of life. It was a warning of the internal rot that was beginning to consume the McLean household. Evalyn believed she had won the negotiation of a lifetime, but the contract she signed with Cartier had no clause for the preservation of her children. By 1915, the McLean estate, known as Friendship, had become a 75-acre sovereign territory within the borders of Washington, D.C. This was not merely a residence. It was a complex logistical operation requiring a staff of over 100 full-time employees. The main house, a sprawling colonial revival structure, was engineered to function as a self-sustaining social factory. The monthly maintenance budget reached $40,000, a figure that, when adjusted for 2026 inflation and purchasing power, translates to approximately $1,380,000 every 30 days. This capital was allocated toward the operation of a private power plant, a massive industrial kitchen capable of serving 400 guests on 2 hours' notice, and a stable of vehicles that represented the pinnacle of Edwardian engineering. The engineering of Friendship was hidden behind silk wallpapers and mahogany paneling. To maintain the tropical atmosphere Evalyn demanded during the brutal D.C. winters, the estate utilized a sophisticated steam heating network. This system consumed over 300 tons of anthracite coal per season, managed by a team of firemen working in subterranean boiler rooms. The heat was piped into a 15,000-square-foot conservatory, a glass and steel structure that housed imported orchids, palm trees, and rare South American ferns. The cost of maintaining the temperature at a constant 78 degrees Fahrenheit in mid-January was roughly $15,000 in 2026 value per month. This was financial anesthesia, the use of extreme wealth to negate the laws of nature and the realities of the climate. Evalyn's mobile assets were equally extravagant. Her primary vehicle was a 1915 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. Technically, the Silver Ghost was a masterpiece of mechanical silence, featuring a 7.4-liter, 6-cylinder engine that produced 50 horsepower. The chassis was constructed from high-tensile steel, while the bodywork was custom-ordered from Brewster and Kniefern, finished in a specific shade of McLean blue. The vehicle cost $14,000 in 1915, equivalent to $465,000 today. When Evalyn traveled, she did not merely use a car, she moved in a pressurized cabin of status. For maritime excursions, the family utilized the Evalyn, a 140-foot steam yacht with a steel hull and twin-screw propulsion. The vessel required a permanent crew of 20 and cost $3,500 per day to operate in 2026 terms, regardless of whether it left the pier. The macroeconomic environment of this period was defined by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and the introduction of the first permanent federal income tax via the 16th Amendment. While the rest of the American upper class began to restructure their holdings to mitigate tax exposure, the McLeans operated with a total lack of fiscal discipline. They believed their media monopolies, the Washington Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer, rendered them immune to legislative interference. The Post at the time was located at 1337 E Street, NW. Its newsroom was a cavernous space filled with Underwood No. 5 typewriters and the constant clatter of linotype machines. The paper was Ned McLean's toy, a mechanism he used to secure invitations to the Gridiron Club and to maintain a seat at the table with President Woodrow Wilson. Inside friendship, the social hierarchy was enforced with surgical precision. Evalyn's Sunday luncheons were the most coveted tickets in the capital. The etiquette was rigid. Guests were seated according to the Green Book of Social Precedents. The menus often included out-of-season delicacies like Caspian caviar, which had to be transported in ice-packed lead containers via transatlantic steamers and then by high-speed rail to Washington. The logistics of a single dinner party involved more coordination than most mid-sized military maneuvers. Yet for all the gold-plated service and the floral opulence, the air inside the mansion was becoming increasingly toxic. Ned McLean's consumption of absinthe had progressed from a social lubricant to a chemical necessity. He began to exhibit the classic symptoms of thujone poisoning: tremors, auditory hallucinations, and a burgeoning paranoia that even his vast wealth could not suppress. Evalyn, meanwhile, sought refuge in the blue depths of the Hope Diamond, often wearing it during solitary meals. The mansion had become a gilded labyrinth where the two protagonists were rapidly losing sight of each other. The fortress was complete, but the inhabitants were already beginning to starve in the midst of plenty. As the United States was drawn into the First World War in 1917, the gap between Evalyn McLean's public persona and her private reality widened into a chasm. To the American public, she was the First Lady of Washington, a title she maintained through strategic philanthropy and the sheer gravitational pull of her jewelry collection. However, the technical management of the McLean fortune was in a state of catastrophic decline. Ned McLean, as the publisher of the Washington Post, was more interested in the social prestige of the role than the industrial reality of newspaper management. Circulation was stagnant at 60,000 copies, and the high cost of newsprint, which had tripled during the war due to supply chain disruptions in Scandinavia, was draining the paper's reserves. Ned's solution was not to innovate, but to borrow against the Walsh mining interests, effectively cannibalizing his wife's inheritance to fund a failing media asset. The internal rot of the marriage was accelerated by Ned's blatant and expensive infidelities. He maintained a series of apartments in New York and Washington for his mistresses, funding their lifestyles with business expenses that reached $200,000 annually, roughly $4.8 million in 2026 currency. He was frequently seen in the company of showgirls from the Ziegfeld Follies, providing them with jewelry that, while impressive, never rivaled the pieces he had given Evalyn. This was a tactical humiliation. Evalyn responded by retreating into a nerve tonic dependency. In 1918, the pharmaceutical industry was largely unregulated. Many common sedatives prescribed to wealthy women contained high concentrations of chloral hydrate and bromides. These chemicals, meant to soothe the hysteria of the Gilded Age, were actually potent central nervous system depressants that caused cognitive slowing and emotional volatility. The macro context of 1918 brought a global horror that even the gates of friendship could not exclude: the Spanish flu. As the H1N1 virus swept through the capital, killing nearly 3,000 Washingtonians in a matter of weeks, Evalyn's isolation became literal. The pandemic forced the suspension of the grand balls and the Sunday luncheons. In the silence of the 60-room mansion, the sounds of Ned's drunken rages became unavoidable. The social mask was no longer necessary because there was no audience to witness its removal. The McLeans were two people trapped in a house that cost $32 million to build, but which offered no protection against the biological reality of a virus or the psychological reality of a failing marriage. Secondary figures in this drama began to circle the estate like vultures. Sissy Patterson, the ambitious heiress to the Chicago Tribune fortune and a future media mogul in her own right, watched the decline of the McLeans with cold calculation. She recognized that Ned's mismanagement of the Post was creating a vacuum in the D.C. media market. Meanwhile, the board of directors at the Cincinnati Enquirer began to initiate secret legal maneuvers to insulate the paper's profits from Ned's erratic withdrawals. They viewed him as a liability to the Fourth Estate, a man whose personal vices were beginning to threaten the technical stability of a multi-state news organization. The year 1919 arrived with a deceptive sense of relief. The war was over, and the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated. Evalyn believed that with the return to normalcy, she could rebuild the facade of her life. She planned a massive homecoming season, reinvesting in the aesthetics of her dominance. She ordered new gowns from the House of Worth in Paris, featuring intricate beadwork that required 400 man-hours of labor per garment. These dresses, costing $3,000 in 1919, $58,000 today, were designed to distract from the lines of exhaustion on her face. She put the Hope Diamond back on, believing that its curse had been satiated by the global tragedy of the war. She was wrong. The diamond's ledger was still open, and the debt it was about to collect would be paid in the only currency that Evalyn McLean truly valued more than gold. The silence of the house was about to be broken by a sound that no amount of wealth could ever silence. October 29, 1929, was not a singular event for the McLean dynasty, but the final structural failure in an architecture that had been decaying for a decade. As the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted, losing nearly 25% of its value in 48 hours, the Gilded Age wealth of the McLeans, built on the extraction of Colorado gold, met the new reality of the Great Depression. In 1929, the American economy was over-leveraged and under-regulated. For Evalyn and Ned, the crash was a mathematical certainty. Their lifestyle had been funded by the Walsh mining dividends, but the San Juan mountain veins were narrowing. By 1930, the technical cost of extracting an ounce of gold from the Campbird mine exceeded its market price. The machinery was rusting, and the capital required for deep earth ventilation and hydraulic drilling was no longer available. While the nation faced a 25% unemployment rate and breadlines began to snake through the streets of Washington, D.C., Evalyn McLean refused to acknowledge the contraction of her empire. She maintained the friendship estate with a defiance that bordered on the pathological. The monthly upkeep, which included the maintenance of 20 guest suites and the operation of a private fleet of Packard and Rolls-Royce vehicles, continued to drain nearly $50,000 a month, roughly $1,050,000 in 2026 currency. To fund this, Evalyn began to engage in predatory borrowing, taking high-interest loans against her jewelry and property. The macroeconomic landscape of the 1930s was defined by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and the failure of over 9,000 banks. Wealth was no longer a static shield. It was a liquid asset that was rapidly evaporating. The most visible casualty of this mismanagement was the Washington Post. By 1931, the paper was a financial corpse. Ned McLean's editorship was defined by neglect and the use of the publication as a political cudgel for the Ohio Gang, a circle of corrupt politicians surrounding the late President Warren G. Harding. The Teapot Dome scandal had already tarnished the McLean name, as Ned was implicated in providing a false alibi for Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall regarding a $100,000 bribe. Technically, the Post was suffering from obsolete infrastructure. Its printing plant at 1337 E Street was equipped with aging Gauss high-speed presses that were prone to mechanical failure and required excessive man-hours to operate. The circulation had stagnated, and advertising revenue, the lifeblood of the Fourth Estate, had migrated to the burgeoning medium of radio. In 1933, the Post was declared bankrupt. It was sold at a public auction for a mere $825,000. In 2026 terms, this equates to roughly $20.8 million, a pittance for a major metropolitan daily. The buyer was Eugene Meyer, a former chairman of the Federal Reserve who understood the technical transition from personal vanity publishing to corporate media dominance. The social cost of this decline was marked by the emergence of Prohibition-era organized crime. While Evalyn hosted dinners for the remaining political elite, the alcohol served was often sourced through the medicinal liquor loophole. In 1930, physicians could legally prescribe whiskey for ailments, and the McLeans utilized a network of doctors to stock their cellar with cases of Old Grandad and medicinal gin. The cost of a single bootlegged case of high-quality scotch was $100, nearly $2,100 today. This was the Prohibition Premium, a tax on the wealthy that funded the very underworld that was beginning to eye the McLean jewels. Evalyn remained trapped in the aesthetics of 1911. She continued to wear the Hope Diamond to embassy parties, seemingly unaware that the world outside her gates had transitioned from the era of robber barons to the era of Hoovervilles. Her fortune was no longer an empire. It was a collection of relics. The dust of the Great Depression was settling on the velvet boxes of her jewelry, and the shadow of the diamond was about to manifest in a scheme that would exploit her last remaining resource, her maternal desperation. In March 1932, the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh Jr. became the crime of the century, a moment that transfixed the global collective consciousness. For Evalyn McLean, the tragedy of the Lindberghs echoed her own loss of Vincent in 1919. She saw an opportunity for redemption, a chance to use the McLean influence to succeed where the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, was failing. At the time, the Bureau, under the nascent leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, was technically limited in its interstate jurisdiction. The investigation was a chaotic mix of local New Jersey police, private investigators, and underworld informants. The macro context of 1932 was one of lawlessness. The Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping a federal capital offense, had not yet been passed. Evalyn was approached by Gaston Means, a man whose biography was a technical manual on deception. Means was a former agent of the Department of Justice and a convicted swindler who had once been an operative for the German government during World War I. He was a master of the Big Con, utilizing his knowledge of bureau protocols to manufacture a plausible narrative. He convinced Evalyn that he was in contact with the kidnappers, a fictional gang he called the Foxes. He claimed that for a payment of $100,000, he could facilitate the return of the child. In 2026 purchasing power, this was a $2,320,000 cash transaction. Evalyn, operating on raw instinct and bypassed by her legal advisors, withdrew the funds from her diminishing accounts. The logistics of the ransom payment were handled with a secrecy that played into Means' hands. Evalyn delivered the $100,000 in two $50,000 increments. The currency of the era consisted of large-size Federal Reserve notes and gold certificates. To transport this much cash physically required a reinforced leather satchel. $100,000 in $20 and $50 bills weighed approximately 5 pounds. Evalyn even considered handing over the Hope Diamond as collateral if the kidnappers demanded more. She took Gaston Means into her home, providing him with a private suite and a car. For weeks she followed his instructions, traveling to clandestine meeting points in South Carolina and New York, always waiting for a child that would never arrive. Means used the time to meticulously drain the funds, spending Evalyn's money on high-stakes gambling and luxury hotels. The technical failure of the Lindbergh investigation was later attributed to the lack of forensic coordination. The ransom notes were analyzed using primitive handwriting comparison And the Lindbergh ladder, the homemade wooden ladder used to reach the nursery, was a masterpiece of amateur carpentry that the police failed to trace for years. While Evalyn was chasing shadows with Gaston means, the FBI was beginning to use the case to justify a massive expansion of federal power. Hoover viewed Evalyn's amateur interference with extreme hostility. When the body of the Lindbergh baby was found in May 1932, only 5 miles from the Hopewell estate, the illusion shattered. Evalyn had not only lost her money, she had become a national laughingstock. She was the dupe of the decade, a woman whose wealth had made her so insulated from reality that she could be swindled by a man whose criminal record was public knowledge. Gaston Means was eventually arrested and sentenced to 15 years in Leavenworth, but the $100,000 was never recovered. The humiliation was absolute. The press, which had once been controlled by her husband, now turned its predatory gaze on Evalyn. They portrayed her as a relic of a dying age, a woman with a cursed diamond and a broken mind. The legal fees to defend herself against the fallout of the scandal, combined with the loss of the ransom money, forced Evalyn to begin the liquidation of her secondary properties. She was no longer the Donna da Verdade in Washington. She was a target. Her husband Ned was descending into a permanent alcoholic fog, and the management of their remaining assets fell into the hands of cold-blooded executors. The shadow was no longer just a metaphor for the diamond's curse. It was the darkening of Evalyn's own sanity. The woman who once owned the news was now its most tragic headline. By 1933, the internal architecture of the McLean family had suffered a total structural collapse. The legal proceedings that followed were not merely a divorce, but a multi-front war involving the Walsh mining trusts, the remains of the McLean media empire, and the literal sanity of Edward Ned McLean. In the early 1930s, the legal definition of insanity was inextricably linked to the Habitual Drunkards Act. Ned's condition, diagnosed as Korsakoff's psychosis, a chronic memory disorder caused by severe thiamine deficiency due to alcohol abuse, rendered him a ward of the court. The man who once controlled the political narrative of the capital was committed to the Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital, a psychiatric institution in Maryland. The technicality of Ned's commitment was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering. Evalyn had to prove that her husband was incapable of managing his own affairs to prevent him from liquidating the last of the Walsh trust funds to pay his mounting gambling debts and alimony to various mistresses. The cost of this legal defense was astronomical. Between 1933 and 1935, Evalyn spent over $250,000 on attorney fees and private investigators, roughly $6.3 million in 2026 purchasing power. Her lead counsel was Frank J. Hogan, a legendary D.C. trial lawyer known for his silver tongue and his $1,000 a day retainer, equivalent to $25,000 today. Hogan's strategy was to paint Ned as a chemical casualty, utilizing the medical records of his absinthe-induced hallucinations as evidence. While the legal battle raged, the macroeconomic environment of the New Deal era was tightening around the McLeans. The Revenue Act of 1935, often called the Wealth Tax Act, introduced graduated income taxes reaching up to 75% for the highest earners. Evalyn, who had never operated within a budget, was suddenly viewed by the Internal Revenue Service as a primary target. Her assets were no longer generating the gold dividends of the 1890s. They were static, depreciating properties. The Friendship Estate, once a symbol of dominance, was now a tax liability of over $100,000 annually, $2.5 million today. To survive, Evalyn began a fire sale of the family's smaller assets, selling off real estate in Newport and Cincinnati at fractions of their 1920s values. Secondary characters in this legal drama, such as the court-appointed conservators of the McLean estate, viewed Evalyn with a mixture of pity and administrative frustration. They saw a woman who would fight for $10 million in court while wearing a $6 million diamond, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her liquidity was nearing zero. The press followed the McLean madness with predatory detail. Every hearing at the District of Columbia Supreme Court was a public spectacle. The once revered name of Thomas Walsh was now dragged through testimonies regarding Ned's uncontrollable urges and Evalyn's delusional spending. Inside the sanatorium, Ned McLean was a ghost. The psychiatric treatments of 1934 included hydrotherapy, prolonged immersion in baths to calm the nervous system, and early forms of insulin shock therapy. The cost of his private suite and around-the-clock nursing care was a fabulous $500 per week, or $38,000 in 2026 value. Even in his madness, Ned remained a drain on the Walsh gold. Evalyn, now legally separated but perpetually tied to Ned's medical bills, was left to raise their daughter, Evalyn Evie McLean, in an environment of toxic litigation. Evie, at 14, was already showing signs of the McLean trait, an impulsive, self-destructive streak fueled by the crushing weight of her inheritance. The Hope Diamond remained in Evalyn's possession, but the legal war of attrition had stripped away the prestige that once made it glow. The Tavernier Blue was no longer a jewel. It was a millstone around the neck of a woman who was slowly realizing that the law could be just as cold as the stone. As the 1940s dawned and the world shifted toward the industrial mobilization of World War II, Evalyn McLean withdrew into the 75-acre fortress of Friendship. The mansion had become an archive of a dead era. The logistics of maintaining such an estate during wartime were nearly impossible due to labor shortages and the rationing of fuel oil. To heat the 60-room house, Evalyn had to navigate the Office of Price Administration, OPA, regulations, which limited the amount of anthracite coal available for non-essential heating. The temperatures in the grand ballroom dropped to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, forcing Evalyn to live primarily in a small suite of rooms on the second floor. She was a woman who once controlled the climate of her home, now humbled by the technical realities of a global war. Her physical decline was marked by a dependency on barbiturates, specifically Seconal and Nembutal. These red devils and yellow jackets were the pharmaceutical staples of the 1940s upper class, used to treat the insomnia that was actually the byproduct of chronic anxiety. The technical effect of these drugs is a depression of the central nervous system, leading to slurred speech, impaired motor coordination, and a gradual erosion of cognitive function. Evalyn moved through the silent corridors of her mansion like a shadow. There were frequent reports from the remaining staff of the mistress gardening in the middle of the night, using a flashlight to prune her roses while the Hope Diamond swung from her neck. She would wear the stone while reading the morning newspapers, now competitors to her husband's lost empire, marking the margins with cynical notes about the new society of Washington. The macro context of 1942-1945 saw Washington, D.C. transformed into a war capital. The city was flooded with dollar-a-year men and military personnel. The old social hierarchy of the 400 was replaced by the functional power of the War Production Board. Evalyn, however, refused to participate in the Victory Garden movement or the scrap metal drives. She viewed the war as an intrusion on her privacy. Her only connection to the outside world was her daughter, Evie. In 1941, Evie had married Senator Robert Rice Reynolds in a desperate attempt at stability. The marriage was a disaster, a repeat of her parents' mistakes, funded by the dwindling Walsh Trust. Evie's struggle with the same nerve tonics as her mother created a feedback loop of addiction within the house. The archive of Friendship tells a story of eccentric poverty. While Evalyn still held assets worth millions in 2026 terms, she lacked the cash to pay the butchers and grocers. She began pawning her minor jewels to local moneylenders to cover the $500 a week grocery bills, $9,200 today. She was a hermit who still insisted on Caspian caviar and French champagne, even if it meant selling a pair of emerald earrings to pay for it. The paranoia intensified. She became convinced that the Hope Diamond was being hunted, not by spirits, but by German spies or IRS agents. She installed additional locks on the internal doors and began to carry a small, pearl-handled .22 caliber pistol in her handbag, a weapon that was more a danger to herself than any intruder. The terminal blow came in September 1946. Evie McLean, age 25, was found dead in her bed at Friendship. The cause was an accidental overdose of sleeping pills. The technical reality of barbiturate toxicity is that the line between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one narrows as the body develops tolerance. For Evalyn, the death of her last child was the final validation of the Cartier curse. She had outlived her husband, her sons, and now her daughter. She sat in the darkened nursery of the mansion, the Hope Diamond glowing with its eerie red phosphorescence in the gloom. The woman who had domesticated the stone was now its only companion. Her health, already compromised by decades of chemical numbing and the stress of a bankrupt empire, began to fail. The blue shadow had finished its work on the lineage. It was now waiting for the matriarch to surrender. By the spring of 1947, the environment within the McLean residence had reached a state of terminal stagnation. Evalyn Walsh McLean was 60 years old, but her biological age had been accelerated by decades of barbiturate dependency and the cumulative psychological trauma of outliving her lineage. The technical cause of her decline was a virulent strain of pneumonia. In 1947, although penicillin had begun to enter the civilian medical market following its massive wartime production, the delivery systems and diagnostic protocols were still maturing. For a patient with a suppressed immune system and chronic respiratory weakness, the infection progressed with aggressive speed. Evalyn was confined to her bed, an antique French Rococo piece that stood as a remnant of her 1908 Parisian honeymoon, while a rotation of private nurses maintained a 24-hour vigil. The technical management of a dying Titan's estate is a cold, bureaucratic process. As Evalyn's breathing became labored, a condition medically termed as Cheney-Stokes respiration, her legal and financial executors were already inventorying the remaining assets. The Walsh Trust, once an overflowing reservoir of Colorado gold, had been reduced to a complex web of debts and depreciating real estate. The primary concern was the jewelry. The Hope Diamond and the Star of the East were not kept in a bank vault during her final days. They remained in a small concealed wall, safe in her bedroom. The safe was a mid-century fireproof model, engineered with a heavy manganese steel door and a 4-number combination lock. It was the only space in the 60-room mansion that remained solvent. The macroeconomic landscape of 1947 was defined by the early tremors of the Cold War and the implementation of the Truman Doctrine. The United States was transitioning into a global superpower, and the old Gilded Age fortunes were viewed as historical curiosities rather than active power centers. Post-war inflation was eroding the value of static wealth. The cost of a high-end funeral in 1947 was approximately $20,500, roughly $38,000 in 2026 currency. For Evalyn, whose liquidity was so low that her executors had to negotiate with local vendors for daily supplies, the irony was absolute. She possessed millions in gemstones, but lacked the cash to pay for the oxygen tanks that briefly extended her life. Secondary figures in this final hour included her daughter-in-law and her few remaining loyal servants. They witnessed a woman who, even in semi-consciousness, would reach for her neck, searching for the weight of the blue diamond. Evalyn died at 6 p.m. on April 26, 1947. The official time of death was recorded by Dr. A. Barclay Lopez. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of vacancy. Within hours of her passing, the Friendship estate was effectively sealed by the probate court. The legal mechanisms of the District of Columbia moved to protect the creditors. The IRS had already filed liens against the estate for unpaid back taxes totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions in 2026 value. The inventory of her bedroom at the time of death was a catalog of tragic excess. Empty vials of Seconal, uncashed dividend checks for negligible amounts, and the heavy, silent safe. The Hope Diamond remained inside, its 45.52 carats of deep blue carbon undisturbed by the death of the woman who thought she had conquered it. The Tavernier curse narrative reached its logical conclusion. Evalyn had died in the same city she once dominated, but she was now a cautionary tale for the new post-war elite. The press coverage was extensive but lacked the reverence of the 1920s. The New York Times and the Washington Post, the paper her husband had lost, noted her death with a clinical detachment. They focused on the Maldição curse and the $100 million baby tragedy of 1919. The cycle of the McLean dynasty had closed, leaving behind a pile of legal documents and a collection of stones that were about to undergo a rigorous technical appraisal. The Blue Shadow was moving on, and its next destination would be a public display of the very wealth that had destroyed its private owners. The liquidation of the McLean estate in 1949 was a landmark event in the history of American gemology. To satisfy the crushing debts and federal tax liens, the entire jewelry collection, including the Hope Diamond, the Star of the East, and a 15-carat emerald known as the McLean Emerald, was put up for sale. The buyer was Harry Winston, a New York jeweler who operated with the technical precision of a financier. Winston purchased the entire collection for approximately $1.1 million in 1949. In 2026 purchasing power, this was a tactical acquisition valued at $14.2 million. Winston did not buy the stones for their sentimental value. He bought them for their recut potential and their marketing gravity. Winston's technical team spent months analyzing the Hope Diamond. They utilized early refractometers and spectroscopic analysis to confirm its Type 2B status. Despite its reputation, Winston was a pragmatist. He toured the Court of Jewels across the United States for nearly a decade, using the Hope Diamond as the centerpiece of a charitable campaign to raise money for the March of Dimes. By 1958, however, the stone had become a logistical and security liability. The macro context of the late 1950s was the height of the space race and the expansion of the Smithsonian Institution as a world-class research center. Winston decided to donate the diamond to the National Museum of Natural History. The logistics of the donation are a study in institutional irony. On November 10, 1958, the most valuable diamond in the world was sent from New York to Washington, D.C. via the United States Postal Service. It was sent as registered mail in a simple brown paper package. The postage cost $244 with an insurance fee of $142.85. In 20 to 26 terms, Winston sent a $350 million asset for a total shipping cost of approximately $1,500. The package was delivered by a mailman named James Todd, who arrived at the Smithsonian on a rainy afternoon. The transition from private cursed relic to public scientific specimen was complete. The stone was assigned the catalog number 217868. While the diamond was being secured in a vault of reinforced glass and steel, the physical ruins of the McLean Empire were being systematically erased. The Friendship Estate was demolished to make way for the McLean Gardens apartment complex. The engineering of the demolition required weeks of effort to bring down the reinforced masonry and the Beaux-Arts limestone facades. The mahogany paneling was sold for scrap, and the gardens where Vincent had played and where Evalyn had gardened in the dark were paved over for parking lots and utility roads. The 20 Massachusetts Avenue mansion was sold to the Indonesian government to serve as its embassy, preserving the architecture but removing any trace of the Walsh family. Secondary figures, such as the grandchildren of Evalyn, inherited only the remnants of the trust after the legal fees and taxes were settled. The hundreds of millions of dollars generated by the Camp Bird mine had been entirely consumed in 2 generations. The technical legacy of Thomas Walsh's gold survived only in the Smithsonian's display. Today, the Hope Diamond attracts over 6 million visitors annually. It is housed in a custom-engineered display case featuring a rotating pedestal and 24-hour sensor-monitored security. The red phosphorescence, once seen as a supernatural heartbeat, is now understood as a standard physical property of boron-doped diamonds. The ruins of the McLean fortune are a monument to the failure of wealth to provide human security. The gold of Colorado, the power of the Washington media, and the brilliance of the world's most famous diamond could not prevent the extinction of the lineage. The narrative of Evalyn McLean ends with a cold scientific reality. The diamond is a stable arrangement of carbon atoms that will endure for billions of years. The human lives that touched it were merely temporary impurities in its history. Evalyn McLean spent her existence trying to own the Hope Diamond, but in the final audit of time, she was merely its most expensive display case.